Thanks very much. And the exam question for the evening is, as Matthew said, does business have a role as a force for good in creating a more sustainable economic, social, and environmental future? And in one sense, it seems a strange question. Business is self-evidently a force for good in the sense that it creates the employment, wealth, and taxes that together make possible everything we value in our society. And its role is especially important right now. Economic growth in the decade up to the recession was driven by government consumption, fueled by unsustainable increases in public debt. The only way out of the economic troubles we now find ourselves in is through sustained expansion in private sector investment and trade. The private sector has the capacity to take up the slack that will be left by the coming squeeze on public sector employment, and it must be given the space to do so. But looked at in another way, I think, tonight's question seems very appropriate. I want to suggest that the past decade or two has been an unsettling period in the history of capitalism. Business cultures have changed, and big strategic errors have been made. In the process, the reputation of business has been dented, and trust in its role has been weakened. The risk now is that the public and political response to what's happened will itself have troubling consequences. If you don't trust an institution to behave properly, well, you impose regulations, perhaps to a point that undermine the dynamic workings of a market economy and in turn hold back the forces of job creation and sustainable economic development. I'll start with a few specific examples of what I think seems to have gone wrong. Then I'll look for generic explanations of what's happened and suggest some possible ways forward. The disaster that has hit the banking sector is obviously the most obvious case of what I have in mind. Banks are supposed to be boring and, above all, cautious. But over the past 20 years, something changed. In a brilliant analysis, Andrew Haldane of the Bank of England showed that for the first 85 years of the last century, shareholders in the financial sector and the banking sector had a very, very dull time indeed. That picture was then transformed in the next 20 years when they made huge excess returns, just about all of which were promptly lost in the following 3 years. In Haldane's words, and I quote, "Banks appear to have discovered a money machine, albeit one whose workings were sometimes impossible to understand. One of the South Sea bubble stocks was memorably sold as a company for carrying out an undertaking of great advantage, but nobody to know what it is." And Haldane concluded that banking became the 21st century equivalent. Most startling of all, perhaps, was what happened to some of the best of the old building societies like Northern Rock, Halifax, Bradford and Billingley. They decided to cash in on the equity that had been built up over many generations and to maximize value for their new shareholders with the results that we all now know about. But I don't think this business culture change was just confined to the banking sector. In his fascinating new book, Obliquity, is that how you pronounce it? I don't know. Anyway, it's a good book. John Kay describes the fate of ICI. For years, its business purpose, he told us, was described as being to serve its customers through the responsible application of chemistry. After surviving a hostile takeover bid in the 1990s, however, it declared a new mission statement. The ICI's group's vision is to be industry leader in creating value for customers and shareholders through market leadership, technological edge, and a world competitive cost base. In the following years, it embarked on a largely unsuccessful series of acquisitions and disposals, which transformed its character and its operations. The share price peaked in 97, a few months after this strategy had been announced, and a couple of years ago, a business which had been part of the backbone of British industry for decades ceased to exist as an independent company. And actually, I think we can all think of other great companies that were seduced over the same period by overambitious growth targets and the pursuit of shareholder value. For me, GEC was only the most tragic example. Much more recently, and surprisingly, there's the Toyota story. This company has for decades been a model to the whole world of manufacturing excellence and of product quality. It seemed unimaginable that it could find itself in a position where a massive vehicle recall was necessary with the accompanying loss of consumer trust. In his written testimony to the US House Oversight Committee, Chief Executive Akio Toyoda said recently, "I fear the pace at which we have grown may have been too quick. Safety had always been the company's top priority, followed by quality and volume, but he suggested this mission had become confused in the rapid dash for growth. We pursued growth over the speed at which we were able to develop our people and our organization, and we should sincerely be mindful of that," Mr. Toyota's testimony said. So why has all this happened? Let me try a few suggestions. Back in the 1980s, American capitalism woke up to the threat of Japanese competition. Business leaders like Jack Welch mounted relentless attacks on corporate complacency and extravagance and galvanized their troops by requiring them to improve returns to shareholders. Much was gained by this culture change, but something was lost as well. One of the great business leaders of the post-war years was Dave Packard, who started up business with his friend Bill Hewlett in a garage in Palo Alto in 1939. In his book, The HP Way, he wrote, "Our ability to properly serve our customers, to finance research and development, to offer rewarding employment opportunities, and to make contributions to the communities in which we operate all depend directly on our ability to generate an adequate profit. That view seemed to become increasingly outdated as the 20th century drew to a close. And the trend was accelerated by some big and related changes in the workings of global capitalism. Globalization was obviously one. The global labor market roughly quadrupled in size during the final 2 decades of the past century as barriers to trade in China, India, former Soviet Union, Latin America, all came down. In a way that had never happened before, it became possible to break up supply chains and locate work to wherever in the world it could be done most efficiently and at the lowest possible cost. And that was good news for consumers who enjoyed a long period of falling import prices and widening choice for goods and services. It was not always so good news for employees and communities. With shareholder value as the prime yardstick, there was often an irresistible case for closing factories in the West and shifting to lower-cost facilities in the East. As a result, big companies were no longer location-specific. They could shift to whichever geography suited them best. And their links with established employees and communities were inevitably weakened. Relationships which had spread back over decades disappeared almost overnight. The growth of hostile takeovers has further accentuated this emphasis on the importance of shareholder value. In an aggressive bid like that for Cadbury, almost the entire value, or almost the entire effort of the defending company comes to focus on maximizing the present value of the company's future dreams. And the pressure on the defending management is to provide the largest possible immediate returns to shareholders, whatever the cost might be, in terms of long-term wealth creation. What's paradoxical about this emphasis on shareholder value is that the shareholders in our biggest companies have also changed radically over the past years. As Martin Wolf wrote in the Financial Times, the presence on share registers of large numbers of foreigners who are fully prepared to exercise their rights of ownership and are unconstrained by national, social, and political bonds has transformed the way companies operate. Thus is global financial capital eroding the autonomy of national capital. And less than half the shares in the FTSE 100 companies are now owned by UK investment institutions. The new groups of shareholders tend to be heavily focused on trading and short-term performance, preferring to take the certainty of short-term capital gains rather than the risks of longer-term returns. And since they're scattered all over the world, there's not a lot of point of government ministers lecturing them on how they should behave. Nowhere were these changes more obvious than in the recent takeover of Cadbury. Ahead of the bid, less than a third of its shares were owned by long-term UK institutions, pension funds, unit trusts, and that sort of thing. As the bid dragged on, foreign investors, and this was an analysis published of this, it was the foreign long-term holders started to sell their shares, mainly to short-term traders and hedge funds. In the words of the chairman, Roger Carr, after the deal was completed, he said, "At the end of the day, there were simply not enough shareholders prepared to take a long-term view of Cadbury and willing to forego short-term gain for longer-term prosperity. Individuals controlling shares which they'd owned for only a few weeks determined the destiny of a company that had been built over almost 200 years. Well, it's quite hard to explain to a wider public, let alone to Cadbury employees, why these strictly short-term interests should have been given such an overriding priority. Related to all these changes is another big shift in corporate culture, at least for the biggest companies. According to Income Data Services, the chief executives of the UK's 100 largest companies will have earned 81 times the average pay of all full-time workers in 2009, up from 47 times the average wage back in the year 2000 over a 9-year period. For the first time in history, it's become possible for a manager, as opposed to an owner of a large company, to become seriously rich. And of course, there are all kinds of reasons why pay levels in these companies have gone up in the way that they have. The emergence of a global labour market for talent, much more critical exposure in the public eye, shorter job time spans, competition from other forms of capital like private equity. I won't list them all now. But I think there are, in the context of what we're talking about tonight, at least two potentially adverse consequences. One is that where compensation is closely linked to shareholder returns, which it usually is, executives have another powerful reason to maximize short-term profits, especially as their time in office is often strictly limited. If they're only going to be in the job for a few years, it's quite hard for them to place great weight on plans that might take many years to pay off. And the other adverse consequence is that it's difficult to persuade the public that profits are no more than the necessary lifeblood of a successful business if they see a small cohort at the top making such large rewards. If leaders of big companies seem to occupy a different galaxy from the rest of the community, they risk being treated as aliens. Globalization, hostile takeover bids, changes in the structure of company ownership and compensation, all these have, I think, contributed to what's been happening to big companies in the last decade or so. And there's been one other big driver of change I'd like to mention. I hope this one more temporary in nature. In the years leading up to the crash, the price of risk-taking around the world fell to absurdly low levels. Interest rates were flat and stable, credit was plentiful, asset prices were rising. A ridiculously dodgy credit risk, like me, could borrow money at not much more than the safest borrower in the world, the US Treasury. For a while, it seemed, the more you borrowed, the richer you became. And this was certainly the big mistake made by a number of the banks. In the 5 years ahead of the credit crunch, over 2/3 of all new lending to non-financial borrowers in this country went to commercial real estate. 2/3, roughly. Everybody knew that property prices could only go up, and everybody was wrong. Again, it wasn't just the banks who had a rush of blood to the head. For a few years, a fair number of other companies also seemed to put as much effort into managing their balance sheets as into winning their customers. They swapped their equity for debt. They raised money on their real estate. They made their assets sweat. Now, I don't want to exaggerate this picture of corporate folly. The fact is that many UK businesses went into the recession in pretty good shape, and evidence for that actually is the fact that business insolvency rates so far in this recession are running at a much, much lower rate than they were in the early 90s. By now, actually, by past precedents, we should be in the middle of carnage, and we aren't. Moreover, the most admired UK companies have not succumbed to the kind of pressures I've been describing. I can remember Rolls-Royce being heavily criticised by the City of London in the 1990s. for continuing to invest in new engines rather than maximising the returns on its existing products. It's stuck to its guns and is now recognised everywhere as an outstanding high-value business, and one which still has strong roots in its hometown of Derby. Tesco is another example, chosen to build an international business rather clearly from the ground up, as opposed to making high-priced acquisitions. Result today, one of the biggest and most successful retailers in the world. Not at all what you would have guessed, I can remember 25 years ago when it was struggling to establish its marketplace here in the UK. It's true that, take another example, it's true that HSBC got a bloody nose from a US acquisition, but again, you would not have bet 15 years ago that it would emerge as one of the world's most successful banks. Of course, having strong roots in Asia helped there. But public trust in business, I want to argue, matters to all companies, including those with the most impeccable records. Reputation loss is contagious, and there's plenty of evidence that the banking sector's troubles are affecting public perceptions of business more generally. The US Business Roundtable Institute for Corporate Ethics highlighted this in a recent publication by asking the question, who paid for the Enron-era scandals? The short answer was that all companies and their investors paid by having to comply with the Sarbanes-Oxley legislation that followed, and that was costed at about $35 billion. The Roundtable cited another study that put the cost of business compliance with US government regulations at $1.1 trillion a year, which is about 10% of GDP. So I think that even the most successful companies have a strong interest in the way that business in general is regarded by the public and the politicians. And this in turn means, to go back to tonight's theme, they need business broadly defined to be seen as a positive force in creating a more sustainable economic, social, and environmental future. The question is whether this is compatible with the pursuit of shareholder value, and the answer depends on how you define that metric. I've listed examples of the pressures that have emerged in the past 20 years to concentrate on the short term and some of the adverse consequences that that's had. But maybe the world is beginning to change. Over the past few months, we at the CBI have asked hundreds of our member companies, how they thought business might be changed as a result of this credit-led recession. Would things be fundamentally different in the future, or would it be back to business as usual after an uncomfortable blip? Not surprisingly, given the sort of scale of what's happened, most of them felt their world would change very substantially. And their conclusions are fascinating. You can see them on our website. I'll just pick out a couple of points that are relevant to, I think, to this discussion. Most companies expected their cost of capital would rise and their reliance on debt would have to fall. Less focus on financial engineering, more on the day-to-day operations of the business. And a more collaborative approach would emerge, they think, with various different groups of stakeholders. For example, they talked about doing more work with schools and colleges and universities, and this is starting to happen now. The recession also exposed other weaknesses in the corporate system. For example, the shortcomings of trade credit insurance. The insurers, it turned out, took their umbrellas away as soon as it started to rain. And in future, because of that shocking experience, companies won't rely on such intermediaries to protect their trading activities. Instead, they'll engage much more directly with their suppliers and customers. They'll have to get to know each other better and up to a point be prepared to help each other out. And companies are already starting to build longer-term relations with different groups of suppliers and creditors. A year ago, it was very striking when a number of big firms that I knew said, look, we're actually more worried now about our suppliers than our customers. Some of their key suppliers were running into big financial trouble. And in some cases, it made sense for them to finance their suppliers themselves. After all, their own credit rating at the time was often better than that of the banks. And we're seeing more of this now, supplier financial relations building up. Then I think a different angle on the same story is the remarkable outcome so far of what's happened in the labour market through this recession. Output, GDP, has fallen by 6.2% from immediately before the recession started, 6.2%. Employment is down by 1.9%. In the last recession, by contrast, in the early 90s, GDP was down by 2.5% and employment by 3.4%. One reason for this change, for this much less acute response than most people had expected, one reason for that, I'm convinced, is that the skills of the UK workforce have increased considerably over the past 20 years. For example, the proportion of working-age employees who have been through higher education has risen from around a fifth to about a third. If you look at the manufacturing sector, which has lost over 1 million jobs, the bulk of those jobs have been in process workers of one kind or another, less skilled jobs. And this talent, this more highly skilled workforce, is hard to find and it's expensive to fire. And that, again, I think suggests the case, which may already be being seen, of a different, more collaborative, more lasting relationships with employees in the future. One of the strongest messages coming through from our members now is their concern about business reputation and the declining trust in business. They recognise that public confidence has been shaken by the events of the past 2 years. They worry that business is in danger of being seen as the problem rather than the solution. They argue that reputation shouldn't be confused with image, identity, goodwill, or brand. And a positive outcome from all this, they suggest, will require a change of mindset, behaviour, and communications. And that means business will have to become less defensive, more open, and they want us at the CBI, these companies, to be an active part in this debate. So what all this suggests to me is that the era of Jack Welch capitalism may be drawing to a close. If you concentrate in this environment on maximising value to shareholders over the short term, you put at risk the other relationships that will determine your long-term success. Suppliers, customers, employees, communities, their interests are aligned with those of shareholders over the long term, but not necessarily over the short. And if they're going to be given greater weight in business decision-making, ideas about profit maximisation will have to change. Jack Welch himself certainly seems to think so. Last year he told the FT that shareholder value is the dumbest idea in the world. And he went on a few days later to write in his Business Week column that the job of a leader and his or her team is to deliver to commitments in the short term while investing in the long-term health of the business. And he went on to talk about how employees benefit from job security, customers benefit from better products, communities benefit from better relationships with firms. All that doesn't sound to me all that very different from the ideas of my hero, Dave Packard. And this isn't just a kind of lone voice on the other side of the Atlantic. Just in the past couple of months, I've seen several thoughtful leaders of big European businesses sort of debate to themselves aloud, express reservations about this metric of shareholder value. My old boss, Marjorie Scardino at Pearson, Paul Pullman at Unilever, Stephen Green at HSBC. I think that things may be shifting a bit. If that's the case, how can businesses adapt? I think they need to move on two broad fronts. First, they need to hold a mirror up to themselves and see how their behaviours might look to the outside world. Second, they need to get better at articulating their strategic goals and priorities. The late Peter Drucker, the great business philosopher, used to argue that managers did themselves a huge disservice by constantly banging on about the profit motive and shareholder value. He put it this way: managers constantly complain about the public hostility to profit. They rarely realise that their own rhetoric is one of the main reasons for this hostility. For indeed, he said, in the terms management uses when it talks to the public, there is no possible justification for profit, no explanation for its existence, no function it performs. There's only the desire of some anonymous capitalists, and why that desire should be indulged by society any more than bigamy, for example, is never explained. Well, I think you can make the same argument about undue emphasis on shareholder value. When that metric is used as a justification at the same time for a socking great salary for the chief executive and for closing down a factory, it's hardly surprising if the public views it with some suspicion. And this US Business Roundtable that I mentioned has argued persuasively that to build public trust, businesses need to create value for multiple groups of stakeholders and show authentically that they have values and interests in common with them. This means, among other things, they argue, that businesses must pay attention to wider social issues and make an effort to see themselves as others see them. What follows from this is that community engagement is not a matter of philanthropy. On the contrary, it's a matter of corporate self-interest. Companies have a real interest in the well-being of the communities in which they operate, as well as in being seen as a positive force in society rather than the opposite. In this context, it was interesting to me to follow the argument about bankers' bonuses. It seemed hard for some in the city to understand why the public was so upset. After all, the people who were getting paid large sums had themselves created huge profits for their firms and deserved no less. But the average salary in this country is well under $30,000 a year, well under $30,000 a year. The bankers had been bailed out by the taxpayer and were now receiving payments beyond most taxpayers' wildest dreams. So what to do about this? What lines of argument could one develop on the compensation question? One line of thought would be to provide incentives in executives' package which are not simply confined to shareholder value. For example, executives of Akzo Nobel, the Dutch company, the Netherlands company that acquired ICI, they are paid in part according to the company's position on the Dow Jones Sustainability Index. If they do well on that, they get more. If they do badly, they go down. Marriott Hotels in the US rewards its executives in part on how their business is rated by its customers, the franchisees. And at least that might go some way towards the alignment of interests that the Round Table suggests is important. Is there a way of throwing grit into the takeover machine without resorting to protectionism or giving too much protection, too much shelter to incumbent managers? Well, I don't agree with today's proposals from the Liberal Democrats they announced this morning, that a public interest test should be restored to takeovers so that government ministers could decide to block takeovers for reasons other than to do with competition policy. Before this test was removed in 2002, it was all too easy for ministers to intervene for political rather than economic reasons in takeover bids. There was very little consistency or predictability in their approach. It often seemed more a question of who'd managed to nobble them in the House of Commons tea room. But Lord Mandelson has thrown up some interesting ideas on this front that I think are worth exploring, and we could also be thinking of ways to encourage investing institutions to take longer-term views, maybe by tweaking the capital gains tax arrangements, or looking at some of those regulations and tax changes that have turned our pension funds for year after year after year into net overall sellers of equities. I think it would help too if more business leaders were prepared to put their heads above the parapet and explain their positive role in society. You can see why so many are unwilling to do so. They've not been trained to stand up in front of cameras, and the personal and corporate risks of doing so in the face of a hostile media are obvious. Yet there are important and worthwhile stories to tell about the way a number of UK companies, like Sky actually as it happens, have taken a leadership role in the fight against climate change. Governments can't reduce greenhouse gas emissions by themselves. Governments have to set regulations and provide incentives. Businesses have to work with them to provide the products and services that together can help consumers to change their behaviours in a radical way. This has to be a partnership. There are other good stories about the way private companies are producing good quality service at lower costs in important areas of the public services, about successful research collaboration with universities, about the extraordinary work that many companies of every shape and size are doing to engage with and support their different communities. And I do see a lot of examples of this in my work every week. So maybe we should identify a group of business ambassadors, men and women who are willing to stand their corner when necessary and get on the front foot to tell the wider public about business's proper role in society. I think, like Peter Drucker, that business enterprises should be seen, in his words, as organs of society. They don't exist for their own sake, but to fulfill a specific social purpose, to satisfy a specific need of society, a community, or individuals. They're not ends in themselves, but means. And when they do their job properly, they contribute to the betterment of society by creating goods and services that meet its needs and providing the opportunities through which individuals, employees, can find a purpose in life as well as the means for living it. Means, not ends. If you accept this argument, then you'll also have to agree that the answer to tonight's exam question is yes. Businesses can, and indeed must, be a positive force for good in society. Thank you very much.
Richard, thank you very much for that. I'm going to ask a couple of questions and then we'll open up to the floor and we'll finish at no later than 7:15. So thank you for a fascinating speech. Can I start by asking what might seem like a kind of rather aggressive question given the quantity of the speech, but I guess if you were sort of standing back from what you said, you might say, on the one hand, you've defined a set of deep structural causes for bad behavior or for short-termist behavior, and on the other hand, you've described kind of the need for exhortation and kind of cultural leadership that's going to drive an improvement in behavior. But isn't the real problem that the structural forces are still in place, and in particular, the fact that when you look at investment, on the one hand, you've got, as you described, a group of kind of overseas investors who don't have a particular interest in some of these issues, the reputational issues, national issues, social issues. And on the other hand, even when it comes to domestic long-term investors, we have incredibly weak stewardship. You know, even our long-term British-based investors don't really take their responsibilities terribly seriously on the whole, you know, in relation to, for example, areas like remuneration. Yeah. So do you think exhortation, do you think the kind of vision of the good company is going to be able to stand up in the context of that framework for investment?
Well, I think that, first of all, I was trying to suggest that some of the big trends of the last 20 years may be playing themselves through, that there may be some pushback in some areas. And I would list under that certainly the free credit and the capacity to take risk, which seemed endless. I think that's gone. I think that also companies and all of us have learned a pretty shocking lesson from the events of the last 2 or 3 years, and that will have a lasting impact, at least for a generation, on people going forward. So I hope that there's scope for thinking that it's not just a question of exhortation, that it will become necessary to succeed in this changing world by building the sorts of relations that I described. I was interested to read in The Economist this week the piece on PepsiCo, in a different context altogether, but the strategy of PepsiCo appears to be to build partnerships with suppliers and actually with other firms to work together because they think that will be the most efficient way of going forward. I'm really struck by my numbers on employment. I don't know what you feel about those, but it seems to me that this time last year, people were saying, including the CBI, that unemployment would peak at over 3 million. It's now 2.45 million, and it will probably go up a bit more, but the shock is nothing like what we expected, and it seems to me that points to some sort of changing relationships as well. So that's one block of answers, that I think that the economic circumstances have changed as a result of this shock, and perceptions and driving forces are changing. I think another way of looking at it is to say the United Kingdom is going to need huge direct investment over the next decades, private capital investment. For example, we're going to have to rebuild our power generator, a third of our power generating capacity, and we're going to have to shift to a low carbon economy. This will have to come off private sector balance sheets. And there are huge balance sheets out in the world ready to do that if the framework is right. For example, if we're going to build nuclear, if we're going to build offshore wind on scale, there are balance sheets around the place, some of them British, some of them not, which, given the proper regulatory and tax framework, they will do it. And so again, I don't think one needs to say, well, wouldn't it be wonderful if the Prudential owned 10% of everything like it did a few years ago, and it's unlikely to do in the near future. What we need to be saying is, how can we make sure that the UK is a place where firms like RWE or EDF or Centrica or others want to make substantial long-term investments which will over time be rewarding to their shareholders. And so I think there's a sort of policy framework there that is broader than going to investing institutions and say, kindly change. I can't think of a way of changing the behaviors of investing institutions other than perhaps by thinking about tax and regulation. It's very, very striking to me that pension funds are net sellers of equities every year, and that's partly because of, frankly, it's partly a consequence of the change in tax arrangements which Chancellor Brown put in 1997. It made it less attractive for pension funds to hold equities when they removed that tax credit. It's partly a result of regulation which has made pension funds more risk averse. But the fact is they are selling shares the whole time. It would be good if they could be incentivized. And there are, sorry, I'll stop talking in a bit. But it's, the other thing that I find is quite interesting is that there are some big pools of capital in London, insurance and pension funds, and people are having interesting thoughts about directing some of that long-term capital into infrastructure. The mayor, Boris, has got all sorts of wheezes, which you would expect him to do because he wants all this capital to rebuild London. One or two of the big insurance companies, Legal & General has gone on the record saying it would like to find ways of developing infrastructure finance. So there's sort of clever and creative people thinking of ways of doing it, and I think we've just got to encourage them.
Can I go back to a part of your speech where you talked about the kind of risks that were taken in organisations, kind of mistakes that were made, and how it is that organisations make those mistakes? I think it may have been another of your speeches that I read that you referred to Malcolm Gladwell and his point that most air crashes are a result of human error, and generally speaking, it's the captain rather than the co-pilot, it's the pilot rather than the co-pilot who's flying, because when the pilot's flying, the co-pilot is too afraid to challenge him.
Especially whereas, Korean, according to Malcolm.
Oh, right. But if it's the other way around, if it's the co-pilot who's flying, the pilot isn't afraid to say, hold on, you
exactly.
know, right.
That is right. Yeah.
So it's only kind of reflection you've got about leadership in the business sector, in the sense of the dangers of the kinds of leaders who everyone's frightened to kind of say, hang on.
Yes.
You know, because that was part of what was going on, certainly in the finance sector, was a sense that anybody who blew the whistle or raised ethical questions or risk questions, this wasn't very good for your career.
Exactly. No, I think that's part of the story, and it's part of an era of kind of chief executive as heroes, you know, where the dream was to be on the cover of Fortune magazine and see what happened to quite a few of those people. So I think that is absolutely an issue. And if you look at do you think, therefore, that boards of companies, if you think this chief executive as hero is changed, do you think boards of companies ought to be thinking more about leadership styles as being one of the things they should look at? I think one of the few business books that's worth reading, because most of them are rather boring, is a book by Jim Collins called Good to Great. And he identified a number of US companies that had been successful for generation after generation. And he identified that it was all to do with leadership style, and it was not the chief executive as God. There would be very often, more often than not, there would be internal promotions. It wouldn't be somebody brought in from outside to turn everything on its head and do something different. More often than not, it would be somebody who'd worked in the firm for some time, and there would be a way of behaviour that was different. People would say we don't do things like that around here, and one of the things, I'm sort of reached at a certain age where I need to be really careful about saying things were better in the old days, because they weren't, trust me. But one thing that certainly changed in the city was a sense, there used to be a sense, if you worked for Warburgs, you worked for an institution which had a strong culture set by a very strong leader, and there were things you did do and there were things you didn't do. And you pretty much had a fair idea of what that was, and you were guided by that culture. When that changed after the 90s, and the idea of a corporate identity, in most cases, not all, sort of went away, and you shifted from A to B to C to D, depending on who's going to pay you the most. And I think that's had adverse consequences.
And then finally, before I open it up, can I ask you about your leadership challenge, in the sense that there you are running the country's premier organisation representing business interests, but not the only one. And I've heard tonight that it sounds to me as though you see your leadership role not just as championing business, but as challenging business. But yet, I kind of feel when I hear the CBI on the Today programme, whatever, it's generally speaking criticising government. It's not very often kind of turning its fire back on the business community and saying, look, we should be doing better. I've been to a few CBI dinners and events, and they tend to be celebrations of how wonderful business is, and wouldn't it be better if government kept out of the way? How do you...
Well, that's obviously clear. No point in having a discussion about that.
How do you fulfill your responsibilities to challenge the business community to do better, when at the same time, if you do that, it might not be necessarily good for the CBI in the short term?
Carefully is the answer. I mean, I tell you what I think is interesting, for example, and that's the climate change discussion. And now, in trying to get the dates right, at the end of 2006, we felt as a group that the CBI wasn't in a great place in a discussion about reducing greenhouse gas emissions. And we didn't quite know what to do about it, so what we did was we got a group of CEOs from all different companies, energy-intensive users and suppliers and supermarkets and banks and everybody, insurance companies, and we sat them down and gave them support staff and said, just think about this actually they thought about it for nearly a year. And they came out, during the course of that, you could actually see them becoming more engaged with the subject, thinking, we're not scientists and we're not environmentalists, but we are paid to understand risk, and we think there's a risk here, and we better get to grips with it. And it was very powerful to see that. And they then published a document at the end of 2007, which was, by CBI standards, quite progressive in the sense that it agreed with government. It said we should have more. It actually said we should have mandatory reporting of greenhouse gas emissions. So that was quite something. And I thought we would get a big pushback from our membership. I sort of went in nervously, expecting lots of, and we didn't get any pushback. And I think what that told me was that businesses are like everybody else in society. They see risks, they see opportunities. The conclusions I drew from that were: one, not in any order of priority. One, our members could see that regulations were coming and they better understand them and get ahead of them. Two, they could see that there were risks and there were also opportunities. That there would be new products and services arising in a low carbon, so they better get stuck into that. And three, they could see they had a sense of responsibility. So it's not, every now and again we sound a bit rough, but it's, I think, I do passionately believe that healthy businesses and healthy societies have to be part of the same thing.
I think this evening Richard has laid out very clearly for us the issues in relation to business that we face today. For me, they boil down really to one key theme, which is that business has failed to develop a value model which balances short-term gain against long-term interests. And this failure, I think, is undermining our ability to create not just a sustainable economy, but a more sustainable society and a healthier environment. Now, whilst that's a pretty dark picture, Richard also talked to us about some of the companies who are working to address this imbalance. And he gave us, I think, some very solid reasons why the business community as a whole should engage. And I think the business has got many strengths that it can bring to this challenge, including our capacity to innovate and to break boundaries, and of course our ability to encourage and inspire people to get involved and take action. And as Richard explained, taking a lead here, for me, isn't about playing the nice guy or CSR. It's simply about good business. Now, to my mind, there are really two key reasons for this. First and foremost, I think it's become increasingly crucial to a business's ability to win and to maintain its customers' loyalty. People today want to know that you're using their loyalty and investment to drive positive change in a broad sense. And I think businesses which fail to do so will increasingly cede competitive advantage, and they'll undermine the most valuable thing that they have, which is their relationship with their customers and the communities in which they live and prosper. And secondly, I think if you're genuinely looking to create long-term value in your business, and you're really serious about that, then a stable foundation provided by a sustainable economy, society and environment have all got to be essential prerequisites. And the risks and uncertainty created by a lasting imbalance in any of those can fundamentally undermine that potential to create durable value. So I think all businesses with an eye for tomorrow really need to think about what action they can take to mitigate that risk. And it seems to me that the business leaders who understand that fact and see the business case for action no longer see sustainability as an add-on, but actually part of their core. So tonight's discussion and the Q&A, I think, highlighted for me more and more that business people are starting to think in this way, and that gives me real encouragement, and I hope, Richard, you feel the same way. So if I could, I'd just like to ask you to join me in thanking both Matthew and Richard, and all of you in the audience, actually, for tonight's session, which I found fascinating and insightful. And I'd also like to thank the excellent team here at the RSA, the events team here at the RSA, who've made tonight's event happen. As Matthew said, we hope you can join us all for a drink, but in the meantime, Richard, Matthew, thank you very much.